In 1955, a researcher named James Lovelock was sitting in a laboratory in England, watching a faint trace of gas drift through a spectrometer. He wasn't looking for anything world-changing, he was just doing his job. But what he found would take decades and a quiet revolution of science to fully unravel. What he detected were chemicals, invisible, odorless, and completely synthetic. Chemicals that had never existed in nature before, and they were everywhere, in the air above Antarctica, in the lungs of birds that had never seen a city, in the Arctic ice cores pulled from beneath 10,000 years of history. They came from products, ordinary, everyday products, sold in cheerful packaging with promises of freshness, comfort, and cleanliness. The hidden secret isn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It's quieter than that, more ordinary, more devastating for how mundane it is. It's the gap, the carefully maintained, legally protected, strategically managed gap between what a company knows about its product's true cost and what it tells the world. Not just environmental cost, human cost, health cost, the kind of cost that doesn't show up on a receipt but shows up years later in a body. Researchers at Harvard Medical School published a study in 2019 that found trace levels of PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, in 98% of the American population. 98%. These are compounds linked to thyroid disruption, immune suppression, and certain cancers, and they persist. That's the thing. They don't break down. They don't leave. They accumulate in soil, in water, in blood for generations. In a small town in West Virginia called Parksburg, a cattle farmer named Wilbur Tennant started noticing something wrong with his herd in the late 1990s. Animals dying, organs turning black, a creek on his property running a strange, unnatural color. When he hired a lawyer, a real estate attorney who had no idea what he was walking into, and they began pulling documents from a nearby DuPont plant, they found something extraordinary. Internal memos, risk assessments, studies commissioned by the company itself, studies that showed the chemical being used in their manufacturing process, a compound called PFOA, was potentially dangerous. Those documents were dated 1961. Wilbur's cows started dying in 1999. The gap between what was known and what was done, 38 years. He wasn't a scientist. He was just a man who noticed that something was wrong and refused to stop asking why. This isn't a story about one chemical or one company. That's what makes it so hard to look at directly. It's a story about a model, a business model that has been applied across industries, from tobacco to oil, from pharmaceuticals to fast fashion, where the economics of disclosure are weighed against the economics of silence, and silence almost always wins. Because silence is cheaper. Because the people harmed are, more often than not, the people who can least afford to fight back. Dr. Robert Belleau, the attorney who spent nearly 20 years fighting DuPont over PFOA, put it in terms that stayed with me. He said that when the cost of harm is externalized, pushed out onto communities, onto public health systems, onto the environment, it never actually disappears. It just gets paid by someone else. Someone who didn't sign a contract, someone who never agreed to the deal. Here is the part that stops most people cold. PFOA was phased out in the United States in 2013, a partial victory, hard-won, long overdue. But before the ink was dry on that agreement, the industry had already shifted. New compounds, same properties, same persistence, different names. Gen X chemicals, PFBS, the family tree just kept branching. The secret isn't really a secret anymore. It's been exposed in courtrooms, in documentaries, in peer-reviewed journals, and yet the pattern continues. Because the secret was never really about information. It was about the distance between knowing and being made accountable. And that distance, it turns out, is very, very difficult to close. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with this kind of story. Not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the slow, diffuse grief of realizing that the world you thought you understood was operating on a different set of rules than the ones you were told. Wilbur Tennant's farm is quiet now. The creek still flows. Whether it's clean again, truly clean, is a question that depends on what you mean by clean and how patient you're willing to be with a compound that takes longer to leave the Earth than most humans live. And somewhere right now, there is a researcher in a laboratory looking at data that will take 30 years to reach the rest of us, noticing something, writing it down, filing it away. The question isn't whether another hidden secret exists. Of course it does. The question is whether this time we close the distance faster, whether this time the people who notice something wrong are believed before the cost becomes someone else's inheritance. Some things are hard to unknow. This is one of them. And maybe that's exactly the point.